Yes, it does.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Thank you for checking out this episode of the Keep Klimbing podcast. We're back in the studio today. We've got a really good topic, relevant topic. It's June 10th, and all of the high school baseball is officially wrapped up after this past week. Spring baseball leagues are done. All of the players are transitioning.
Except in Illinois. They got one more week in
That's
state
true.
championships.
That's crossover. We don't talk about them that much.
Yeah, no, you're right.
I'm
You're
just-
correct.
No, we still got some baseball going on, but really the relevant topic for everybody, really, whether you're continuing to play right now or not, is this like transition from spring games, spring ball, to summer baseball, right? And a few quick things. You guys obviously, most of the listeners for this are going to be living it, so I don't have to explain it to you. But transitioning from a spring schedule that involves school, that involves studying, that involves daily practice schedules, and a different dynamic of like game schedules, right? Like a lot of these schools around here anyways have been playing conference games on Tuesday and Wednesdays.
Yep.
Non-conference opponents are tournaments on Thursday, Friday, Saturdays, and juggling that schedule. And then as these spring seasons wind down, we're going to transition into this summer schedule that doesn't include school. Way more free time, way more travel, if your team is going to play out of town tournaments and going to different places. And really even for the teams that are playing more locally, I'd argue that it's more travel too, because you're not just driving back and forth to school every day and playing at like your local conference teams or area opponents, right? Like you're driving to Bridgeton, you're driving to Warrenton, you're driving to these different places, so a little bit more travel included, which I think can't be overlooked.
Yeah, you sleep better in your own bed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of recovery elements that go into just traveling to play a baseball game, and it sounds weird, but you fly on a plane one day and have to pitch the next day, and you'll learn real quick. Holy cow! I just sat on my butt all day and I feel terrible. So it's true. You drive in a car, 6 hours. You get there, you sleep in a hotel, and you got to pop out and pitch at 10 a.m. the next morning. You know it. So. A lot of different dynamics getting into this summer schedule. And right now I would say a lot of people are getting into it, about to get into it. Our league starts next Monday,
Yep.
For Premier. And so some players kind of find themselves in this weird in-between transition time. If their, school kind of got kicked out of the playoffs a little bit earlier, maybe their summer tournaments, schedules, leagues, whatever starts later. You kind of have this weird in-between time where you're coming off a plan, maybe getting a quick breather, giving your arm a quick breather. Maybe you're kind of ramping down a little bit of some of your volume and intensity because you have time to before it really ramps back up, like for the summer. But transitioning into this summer schedule, I think is a unique thing from person to person, player to player, team to team. What's some of your thoughts or opinions on that summer schedule for guys and going into it?
I always look at this, for one, just coming from the state championships, you see a lot of kids that are affected by being a senior, didn't quite get where they wanted to be. They did this, whatnot. So you're dealing, I think, with that mental letdown a little bit. Do you jump right in? Restarting that, what am I playing for in that respect? I think there could be, I think that's an interesting thing. And I never really thought about that too much. Yeah. And then I think, like you said, you come back from that and then you have some of these kids I've seen throwing, 45 to 55 innings of baseball in the spring. Where's your arm at that point? And so you have this mental maybe exhaustion a little bit. And, how does that how does that really affect you going into that? And how do you reset yourself in that mindset? I think it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many different dynamics to consider, in that. And for a pitcher versus a position player, it can look and feel very different. I always talk about like hitter training being much more like a big marathon throughout the year. And I look at pitching training, maybe it has marathon elements for sure, but it's like a week by week kind of feels like a sprint. You know what I mean? Because you're only out there so often. You're typically pitching like 1 or 2 days a week. If you're starting and going multiple innings, it very much so feels like a sprint where like I got 1 day to not only execute, but just like I deplete my energy systems, and then I kind of recover and ramp back up throughout the week, and then I do it again, So it feels like a bunch of, sprints inside of a big marathon of a season. So there's different things to consider for sure from a physicality standpoint, body performance recovery standpoint. But I want to focus, because I know better about it, I want to focus a little bit more specifically on the pitchers in this dynamic in this conversation right now.
Absolutely.
That there's a lot of different things to consider within that. And I think, summer ball in high school and college should be very supplemental. And what I mean by that, it should be something that really enhances your development, your exposure, you as a person and a baseball player. You have so much more time throughout the summer because school's not in, that summer ball for high school players, if that's all you're doing is just like only filling the competitive reps bucket of your overall like progression, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that competitive reps bucket, if you will, with inside of this big, like I think about it like a pie chart, like that there's so many different things, competitive reps, skill training, performance training, sleep, recovery, hydration, nutrition, all of these things that go into, you improving as a baseball player. And, if all we're going to do during the summer is just fill up that competitive reps bucket, I think we're really missing the boat on all the other things that we can do. And I think, the challenge during the spring is with so many other extracurriculars in your schedule and activities that you have to do and perform with school being in, it's a lot harder to find the time to do all of those things for younger players at a high level, at a good level.
Yeah.
Well, now that you got all this time throughout the summer, you could really critically be looking at it on how to improve on a lot of those different areas. And if all we're doing is overflowing the competitive reps bucket, I think we're missing the point, I think there's definitely people and circumstances where, we need to work on more game applied concepts to get better as a player, meaning that should be the bigger focus, and then there's also certain people, dynamic circumstances where maybe less and controlling that competitive reps bucket and filling some more of these other buckets ultimately gets you to where you want to go faster.
Let me ask you this then. Okay, you got this kid, you got, say, coming out of one of maybe the smaller schools, and he's coming in, he's been hitting, he's been the workhorse on the mound. Okay, he's doing this here. Maybe his last 5 outings, have you seen a velocity loss? Have you seen these things? I think the fatigue factor could be the biggest issue when you're transitioning into that.
Yeah.
Looking at how do you compete in the summer?
Yep.
Where are those things at in that respect?
Yeah, that's perfect. So let's talk about workload in that balance and in the big picture of everything very specifically right now. That workload element that you're talking about is probably the number one thing I would say that needs to be considered for players on how do I go about this transition time, and then even furthermore, how do I go about this entire summer based off of that. That at the end of the day, we tell players all the time that if you've thrown the most amount of innings you've thrown this entire spring, then your summer should probably be adjusted because of that. And vice versa. If you didn't get a whole lot of innings in the spring, we probably need to throw more innings during the summer, and just balancing that. I think in general, you're always looking to hopefully increase that inning or workload amount year over year,
right,
by 30-ish%, and that can be kind of argued upon for sure. There's a lot of things that maybe go into that. How you're feeling, how much you've grown, how your arm is performed, because we've talked in previous episodes about like that decline in performance being one of the first red flags for injury purposes, and I think that needs to be discussed and paid attention to throughout that's very real. One of the biggest red flags before an injury comes, maybe even a month beforehand, would be like a performance decline. So if you're velocity is starting to taper off, you could say or argue that you're at a higher risk of injury because of that, but that overall workload amount, that definitely is probably the number one thing from transitioning to spring to summer that really needs to get considered. That, yeah, if you're one of those guys that dang near through 60 innings for your spring high school season, that's a lot of innings. That's a lot of volume within certain days in a very short window, especially if all you threw the entire last year was only 75 innings, because you threw, 35 and 35 in your spring, 35 in your spring and 35 in your summer.
Right.
So
how do you, and I think those are interesting things when you look at the factors of a high school coach compared to a summer coach. You have two different mindsets, don't you, as far as what are you trying to accomplish?
One's very winning on the field focused, and one's probably much more development focused, while it probably depends in the, team or circumstance that you're in, that those things probably get valued a little bit differently from place to place. But definitely much more development focused, I think, during the summer. You would typically say, especially for some of the teams, they probably feel like they have more pitching depth. They feel like they've got to get more of the pitchers in because they pay to play for the team, or you know what I mean? That like they're not just going to keep running the same guys out there. Where in a spring season, because you feel the pressure to win certain games, that does happen. That will happen. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it just needs to be considered. I think as the player or parent or family or summer coach, or those things that kind of come after that spring, that talk about a college player for example, that summer schedule for a college player, if we're doing anything to jeopardize how you show back up on campus, and I would even say that like for a high school kid too, if we do anything to jeopardize where you're at, come the next time that you're really going to be evaluated, or, need to put a good foot forward to make a good first impression your first fall semester on a college campus, or if it's March 1st the next year for a high school kid, if we do anything during that summer timeframe to jeopardize that, especially during very specific years for these players, meaning like after a college commitment's already been made, like would really alter your approach on this, because if you're 16 and you're needing to go out and like showcase really well in front of a lot of college coaches this summer, maybe that looks a little bit different than a 17-year-old kid who's already committed. And maybe that looks a little bit different for a 14-year-old kid that really just isn't at that evaluation stage of his career yet. That, that piece of it really can alter too, like what your overall like approach is for this summer. It needs to be considered, I think, on an individual basis.
Yeah. Because I think the drive to win, you go through this spring, you're setting up, and, coming off that, and you watch a lot of these teams and these kids that are pitching, you see it at the state championships. You get a couple innings, he brings them back the next day. And because they're trying to win a state championship, and you understand that from a coach. I don't think it's a terrible thing, like you said, or anything, but you understand how do you understand, or where's the communication level? Is there much within that coach? I mean, you can't tell a high school coach, you shouldn't pitch that guy.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes a level of trust and whatnot, and relationship building between all parties involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Some trust elements there. I think also when the individual, meaning the player or the parent, has a issue maybe with usage, that it's handled really professionally and appropriately, because I've seen it very mishandled for sure. And
I'm sure.
And on the coach's side too, like, to be fair.
I agree. I understand, because they want to.
Sure. And I mean, no coach goes into it thinking like, well, I don't care about that kid, I'm going to throw him and I'm going to win this game. Like, that's not it. They're looking for ways and angles to accomplish the bigger picture team goal. And I'm going to say this too, that like, the biggest percentage of the time, I'm not even going to put a number to it, but the biggest percentage of the time too, that where I think some of the fault can be is that, I'll give you an example, like a player's like not really feeling that good one week, but he really wants to win. He knows his entire team's relying on them to win too. That, when the coach comes up and says, "Hey, how you feeling today? How's your arm feel today?" Like, "I'm good. I can give you 3 innings." Like that, a lot of that onus falls on the player too, to be very truthful, open, honest, and not just telling the coach what he wants to hear, but even when you have a problem or a negative thing, and that's such a learned skill that sports gives us a really good insight into, because at some point you're going to be a big boy at a job someday, or, have to have a hard conversation with a family member or something like that, where you're going to have a hard conversation and deliver some information that they're not really going to want to hear, and how you go about handling that in a very respectful, professional manner, and you getting to do that as a 16-year-old high school pitcher, and that being some of your first taste of that. Like, what a great life lesson, life skill, that has, and us as parents should be really encouraging these players to get out of the uncomfortability that, get over the uncomfortability that presents them. That, like, look, the reality is that, like, you need to be open and honest and upfront with your coach. And even if he's not going to like what you have to hear to him, you need to be equipped to tell him in a way that's like, "Look, I'd love to be out there for you. And I just am not entirely sure how much my arm's got to give you right now. I'm, barking here or there, after this outing or after that outing." And as open and as transparent and as out front as you can be with all that. Because if it comes down to it, there's always more emotion involved. If it comes down to it, where, hey, it's the 5th inning of the game, and, "Hey, can you throw the 7th?" And it's like, "Nah, coach, I can't." And it seems like it comes out of nowhere, and it's like, what the heck, then feathers get ruffled a little bit, and it's like, well, what, that you feel blindsided by it, ultimately, so I've seen that more times than not, to be honest with you, when there are like situations where there's some overuse or frequency, the player says something about it after the fact, or the parents have something to say about it, or whatever, a lot of it can be trickled all the way back to, like, well, how are those communications on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, just to be open, honest, and transparent about all that, so that's something that I think as a whole we can encourage younger players to do better. Because we have to recognize that adults, those are very uncomfortable conversations, even for us to have to each other, adult to adult, that, like, you throw a, older, experienced, winning high school program or coach or environment with a young player who already just doesn't have the same sort of emotional intelligence yet to deliver a, potentially upsetting like message like that to their coach. Like, it can be a hard conversation to have, and so, yeah, I mean, that's something that I see kind of often.
I wonder sometimes too if some of these kids, just aren't feeling well. You may not be like just physically, you've had to stay up, you're studying a little bit more, and you get physically fatigued, and it's not necessarily a lot of pain, or maybe it's just, "I'm tired, my arm's tired. Coach, can I skip a start?"
Yeah.
I'll swing it, whatnot. And I think those are things sometimes maybe a kid doesn't want to do because he doesn't know how everybody's going to react to that. Well,
for sure.
I'm not saying that you have to or whatnot, but hey, I'll give you 3.
Yeah.
I said, I'm not feeling as strong as, I don't feel good.
Yeah. When in that equation too, I think players got to be really in tune with their body. They got to be in tune with their programs. They got to have a good support system around them to figure out and sift through what tired feels like, and on some sort of scale there too. Because like at what percentage of being tired do I tell the coach, which is, your perception of tired versus mine versus his versus whatever could be very different, right? And I think the biggest thing for big picture, like injury risk mitigation, and I tell guys this all the time, I got told this in professional baseball, and I love the analogy, like, don't turn a 2-week problem into a 2-month problem. The difference between being tired and being in pain, or having some fatigue and being in pain, and at what level of that fatigue does it now start to become an issue? And should I say something, that if the conversation is ongoing and open and transparent, that, you kind of should be able to tell a little bit further in advance, like, when that I should skip a start time frame comes to it. Shouldn't just be a blindsided, like, the night before the game, like, hey, I don't know if I can pitch tomorrow, because you blindside a coach with something like that, and there's going to be some frustration for sure, because now he's probably got his whole week, maybe the next two, kind of scripted out in his head a little bit of how he'd like it to unfold, that you pull the rug out from under him a little bit, and now you're scramble mode, and that affects like all kinds of confidence and conviction and team culture and environment, and you know what I mean? So challenging.
I think it's, people say, well, look at what Michael Jordan did. Yeah, but that was the NBA finals. He's in that, this guy's those are professional baseball players that are playing because they get paid a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Their, standings are tight, and they still do that kind of stuff. Yeah. They'll skip a start with guys, say, hey, he's a little bit, we don't want to push this. So, you know what? Every team gets to go to districts and start fresh again. Your record in that moment, seeding wise, you may maybe drop a one here or there, but okay, fine. Yeah. In the end, if you're that good, people are going to know it is what it is. I think we can reset some of those things that way.
Yeah, for sure. And if you found yourself in that kind of circumstance this spring, and now you're kind of trying to transition to summer ball, I think that's really got to be on the forefront of your mind, because what'll happen is you'll take 3, 5, 7 days off, and you'll start to kind of feel brand new again. Yeah. That you can kind of trick yourself a little bit, and then it, wham, hits you again like July 15th. Just kind of taking this big picture view of what this entire year looks like, or even what the next couple years looks like for you, that, at the end of the day, it's kind of what you should always be doing. But the reality is that there's just like ebbs and flows of how the seasons go, and how the season, like how long you play, and how many innings you threw, and then, how your arm was feeling through all that you kind of lay out these ideas or these plans or these, this journey or this route, with the player. But you have to be ready and willing to adapt, like, month by month or week by week even, and roll with some of those punches, because you just never know what's like around the corner for you, and ultimately keeping that like long-term view in sight. But certainly there's like individual goals, micro goals within a game or a start or a week, or things that players have set in their heart that they want to go do, and you try to help them navigate that as best as possible, but in that big picture, inside of this topic of like transitioning to summer ball, those are all things that you absolutely got to consider. So if you're that player and found yourself in that type of dynamic, your summer should look different than if everything was kosher, throughout the spring, right? It should look very different. And if you're rolling out there just kind of status quo, like continuing to go with whatever,
trying to throw 7 innings.
Yeah. That like, something's going to give, most likely something's going to give. And maybe it's just diminished performance, and that's not what we want either. So on the flip side, let's talk a minute about the player who found themselves not throwing enough innings this spring. You didn't throw enough innings this spring for whatever reason. It could have been because you had an early on injury. It could have been because you had, juniors and seniors ahead of you. It could have been because, you had a lot of good players at your position on your team, that you didn't necessarily fill up that competitive reps bucket for development purposes in the spring.
Agreed.
What you should have been doing in the spring is filling up the other buckets. As soon as you recognize that you weren't filling that bucket, you should have been putting your energy into the other buckets, because that's what's going to help you kind of stay on track. Because now, coming this summer, you're going to want to really fill up that competitive reps bucket, and we're just going to have less time and headspace for the other ones, and that's just how this works. There's only a fixed amount of time. There's only a fixed amount of time. So, during the spring, if you found yourself doing that, you should probably be trying to put yourself in an environment where you get the most amount of competitive reps while balancing the other things. I never think it's a good thing for you to be just,
you can't
blinders on one thing, because this is such a big like piece to this puzzle, multiple puzzle pieces that they all work hand in hand. They all work to supplement and support each other for the ultimate goal, and for you to achieve kind of success on the field and the desired opportunity that you want to come next from it, if there is one. So those are all the things that a player during that time frame should really be considering, and why like it's so case by case for each player and pitcher. And even then, set out a plan, and 2 weeks from now it might change. It might change based off of a ton of different things, physically, mentally, emotionally. What about family stuff kind of comes up, you got to take a couple of weeks off of baseball because something happens within your family, or you got to go take care of some family business, you know, like there's just life that goes on around this that has to, you know, that has to have us be ready, willing, and able to kind of roll with some of these punches too.
That transition piece, you know, you're setting those things. I liked what you said there. You know, you have the kid that didn't get the reps, you have the kid that did and whatnot. How do you set that in motion? You know, what is a number? Is there a number? Is there something you're looking at in that for, I guess you're going to, you know, you're starting in end of March, right? Middle of March. And if you're a good high school player, you're playing through the, you know, mid-August maybe, or even into July, definitely, right?
Yep.
So that's a pretty good period of time that you can stretch out that pitching. So what are you looking at as far as innings, so a kid can kind of understand that thought process?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, that thought process is also relative. That you know, it's got to build from week to week to month to start to year to year, right? Okay. So like if you get all the way up to 50 plus innings in a spring and you'd never thrown more than 15 in a spring, which happens a lot. Yeah. Because like you were a decent pitcher on a pretty good team as a junior that had a lot of seniors, that now a lot of those guys graduate, and now you're one of the, you know, top starters for your team, and you're going, you know, 4 or 5 plus innings every single time. You're going to accrue a lot more innings throughout that time frame. So, you know, you can look at it as like just that spring schedule, and I think that'd be good. And you can look at it as like the entire year annual calendar compared to the previous year. That it's all a balance of that workload, right? So like, give you an example, if you threw 15 in the spring, whatever it was, but like a lower number. If you threw 15 in the spring and then you threw, you know, 40 in the summer, right? So we're at 55 innings there, right? And then the next year you roll out and you throw, you know, 48 innings. You know, we can build on it as long as everything's in check, as long as you're feeling good, as long as your performance metrics are still there, as long as, you know, you're healthy and you know, checking all the boxes, that, you know, we can add for sure a total inning workload, you know, from year to year, you know. But if you went from 55, I would say like, you know, we start getting up around like 75. Basically every inning north of 55, you should just really be in tune with how you feel and what's going on, right? Right. But like as long as we feel good, we can keep like, you know, building on those. So if I roll out and I throw 50 in a spring, you know, I probably only got 25 to 35 to give in the summer, you know. And I think that like that annual workload number and amount, you know, yes, most of the younger players, they don't really know, you know, they don't really know. I wouldn't have been able to tell you when I was that age. My dad might have, you know, but like I probably wouldn't have been.
You weren't looking at that, were you?
No, I was taking the ball and going out and pitching and having a great time and you know, and we were winning games, you know, so I wasn't thinking about any of that. But I also think that like this day and age, like we're way more equipped and prepared to have some of those conversations with a lot of the resources and I mean, even just like the stats that you can go find about high school baseball online these days is just like way more robust than it ever was, you know. So there's a lot more information being tracked like that. Like Game Changer didn't exist, you know, like I had no idea unless like I went back and looked through like the scorebooks or something throughout my summer stuff, or my dad kept track of it. You know, I wasn't keeping track of how many innings I threw during the summer, you know, but that's what should happen. So like after you get done with the spring season, basically after every season that you have, and the way I'd probably look at it is like spring season, summer season, like training season, off season, right? And after every season that you have, you should probably be sitting down and having a good like self-assessment process where you're maybe seeing where you're at relative to your competition. You're seeing like what your workload and how your body feels and all that, and like prepare, you know, self-assessing how the previous, you know, training calendar or like calendar went for you, and then prepping for the calendar ahead, you know. And then you get done with the summer, the same sort of thing, you know, self-assessing how the summer and then probably how the entire year went there too, you know, but then evaluating, well, what do I need to get better at, you know, to align with my goals, my big picture goals. What should I be focusing on this summer, or this off season? Yeah. You know, so after every single big like calendar chunk that you finish or kind of get to the finish line on, you know, that like self-assessment process kind of starts over again. And to be honest with you, we talk about it a lot, and we put out some content about it too. Like even after each game, a player should probably be having a pretty good self-assessment process, and thought process on how that went from a performance standpoint too. And you can continue to do that in like a micro sense where it's like game to game, but then a macro sense of how it goes from season to season.
Because how many kids really understand, how they pitched in the early spring compared to the late summer? They're going to look at, oh, I did fine.
Yeah.
If you don't have analytics or things like that, definition. Fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the coaches, a lot of that onus falls on the coaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how we're defining success for these players, and how we're helping them define success, because they start to have their own idea of a definition of success, and too often it's like, how hard did I throw and how many strikeouts did I have? And while those things are great and we do love, you know what I mean, that like it misses some big critical process oriented goals that we should have to get to those outcome driven goals. The dynamic of that self-assessment process. I think the best players that I've been around have a very critical and intentional self-assessment process that they really understand where they're at, where they want to go, and what they need to do to get there. And it starts to become very black and white. You eliminate a lot of the gray area on that. It starts to become very black and white.
As it should be.
As it should be.
Because if you're in that gray area, you don't know. I always say, people say, well, how you doing? Oh, I guess I'm all right. Well, if you're guessing, you don't know.
Yeah, I guess I'm wrong, for sure.
And that's where you fall into mistakes. And I think the pattern of, I think everybody's goal, you have these goals in high school baseball, especially if you're making varsity, want to win a conference, win districts, and then see where we go from there. But after you transition out of that, how do you do you set that emotion with kids prior to their start, especially kids that you're working with? And I understand not everybody is like this, but I think maybe we should start thinking about that. How do you set that? So if maybe you got a chance to be a starter, here's a goal. We'll see when it comes out, but then do we have a pattern by which once we get past high school baseball, here's our goals and this is how we're going to approach the summer?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it starts with like really big picture goals.
Yeah.
Real quick, I'm sorry. It starts with really big picture goals, and I think that self-assessment process from a very big macro view is like these big picture goals of like, what do you want out of all this? Is it a college opportunity? Is it winning? Is it like a competitive type of goal, winning state, winning a tournament, winning something? And those big picture goals really like kind of set the course of direction of like what we do on a day-to-day basis. And it should. I think you should have like big picture goals, and then you should dwindle that down to like, well, I have to achieve this goal before I get to that goal type of thing. Like if your goal is to be a Major League Baseball player, well, you better figure out how to be a pretty good high school player first, right? Like, so a
very good high school.
Sure, player. And you ask most people, and that's what they'll say. Like, so, well, I want to go play in college. It's okay. Well, how are you going to do that? And I think what you do is you set goals, and you keep asking yourself how you want to do that, and you're going to get all the way to the bottom of this like pyramid where it's going to be very black and white. You're going to ask yourself how so many times that it's going to come all the way down to like, well, okay, then tomorrow I need to do this. To take one step towards that big picture goal.
Right.
And that's where it starts to become much more clear to you. So in this context of like transitioning summer ball, do the exact same thing. Right? You're looking at how the spring went, you're evaluating how it went on the field, how it went from a health standpoint, how it went from a performance standpoint. And when I say performance, I mean more of like performance metrics, right? Like you've got on-field metrics, you got performance metrics, and you got like how you feel health and standpoint. So you're evaluating how that went. You've got this big picture goal in mind. Well, what do I need to do this summer, to accomplish that big picture goal? Okay, well then what do I need to do right now on June 10th to accomplish that goal? And you keep just kind of making these small little stair step goals that eventually lead you to your big picture goals. So that's the best way to go about it. And I think there's so many different circumstances that we could talk about, hypotheticals that, this player's dealing with that and that player's dealing with this, that's why my answer is a little bit blanket right now of saying like, it's a very individual like process,
I agree.
because there's so many different scenarios that like create twists and turns of that overall like development trajectory that we have to recognize where we're at, recognize where we want to go, and then build a plan to help kind of stair step our way to get there. That from a 30,000 foot view, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. So.
I like that part of it because I think to me, when you watch all these kids go through this whole high school season and the mindset and whatnot, as I said before, sometimes, some of these kids are coming out of this and there's a letdown process. And I think you can probably try and get back into and going. And that's where if you're not focused or you don't have the intent, I think that's where injuries happen a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If you're not dialed into those details and you find yourself kind of just going with the flow or doing what everybody else is doing just because that's what you see them doing, more often than not, you're probably going to find yourself in a situation where you like, how did I wind up here? Kind of mentality,
right.
And we put something out about this on Twitter today or X, I should say, just like
formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, formerly. That's right. That, the concept is, the concept was in that content was about like, the talking about like UCL injuries, talking about Tommy John surgeries and talking about, like you don't really think it's going to happen to you until it happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's very few people that go through this and they're like, oh, well, and
I knew it was coming.
Yeah, I knew it was coming. Right. Yeah. And truth be told, if you pitch long enough, it probably is, but, and especially like in this day and age where injuries are becoming so much more prevalent, so much more talked about, the surgeries are getting so much better and different forms of surgeries like a brace versus a full reconstruction and all these different things, right? That, the point of the content was that like, you kind of have to be taking this approach where, that this is a percentage chance that could happen and you should be trying to do everything that you could to like not become a statistic, like not become part of the statistics, and unfortunately, I think too many people don't think about it until they're in it, that they're like, man, then you start to have some type of like, regret maybe that's like, I should have done this different. I should have done that different. That, the concept of like the pain of discipline over the pain of regret, like choosing the pain of to be disciplined and take that intentional approach on a day-to-day basis that takes way more focus and energy and, intentional thoughts and
right.
programs and plans and whatever, that all of that discipline, is far less, the pain of that is far less than the pain of your regret that you didn't do some of those things on down the road. That, I mean, we all know it. Like how many people do you know or have talked to? It's like, oh, well, I was pretty good, but then I got hurt and I never really like got to do anything else after that. That's the unfortunate like reality of our game is that, not just injuries derailing careers from a performance standpoint and never getting back to that peak performance, which a big percentage of people who do that, do everything right afterwards and don't get to the same performance metrics that was going to get them a certain opportunity or that they were hopeful it would. That's a conversation, a statistic like alone, but just the sheer fact, say you did, but the timing of that injury being so critical that it totally changes the course of what you were going to do potentially, like with your career, that, during a very critical recruiting or scouting year for you, like an injury for a college junior that might get drafted in the 6th round, 2 games left of the season is absolutely catastrophic for that guy's career.
Yeah.
Because now he's coming back for another year. He's trying to, he's only got probably one more year of eligibility, that the clock's now really ticking for that person just to get back to a performance level that he was, much less being out that long and being able to go back out and still compete at a high enough clip, which is not talked about enough. Like, just time spent on the shelf, even if you are a really good baseball player. Like, I mean, think about it. If you like played golf all summer versus didn't play golf all summer, and you tried to go out and play in a tournament in September, like, you're going to play way better after playing all year. You know what I mean? Like, that's
Right.
just the reality. So all of that time missed during very critical times of this journey can completely derail, some of the goals or dreams like players have, so taking that intentional approach, taking an intentional approach to your summer this year during this like transition time, making the most of the time that you have, ultimately just for every single day to be trying to take one step forward towards your big picture goals, I think is really the big point here.
Absolutely. Because, I always look at the objective. I know we don't think of this word a lot, but everybody should have an objective. What is that? As you said, some people think MLB, or you think in college, what level of college? Because that objective sets every initiative in everything, every step you do. What is an initiative? If you lose the initiative, you're never going to reach your goal.
Yeah, sure.
And so all those things set in motion that piece that's right here, because to be I like what you said, to be an MLB player, you better be. There's some guys put up video game numbers.
Yeah.
And they're not even playing Division I baseball.
Yeah.
Because of the way that's how difficult all these things have become.
Yeah, absolutely.
So objectifying where you're going to be able to set, so from this time you start, I know what we're doing in high school. I know where my position is in high school. You've had that conversation with the coach. Are you willing to go have that conversation with the coach?
Yeah.
To say, Coach, where am I shot? Where am I at? In your thought process, where it is.
Depth chart. Yeah.
Be honest, and be willing to have that conversation. Yeah. And coach look at you and go, well, I don't think we're going to do much unless an injury or whatnot. This one I'm thinking, okay, fantastic. Set your mind. Are we mature enough to have those conversations?
Most people want to run away from that conversation,
right?
It's an intimidating conversation to have, and
at 16, I know.
Yeah, it's naturally,
right?
It's natural too. We just kind of avoid things that make us feel bad and gravitate towards things that make us feel good. Like, it's just human instinct,
Right.
And it's a very special, uncommon trait for you to like constantly be looking for things that make you feel uncomfortable. And I don't mean to say it like you're constantly looking for it, but you're just not afraid to take those things, head on. That's where a lot of the separating like details and factors can be. Talk about all the changes going on in college baseball right now, and how much harder now from here on out, at least in the short future, because it'll change again certainly in 5 more years. But how much harder now it's become to be a college baseball player with the roster cuts and especially from the highest levels like on down. That like the dynamic has totally changed and should really change a lot of the thoughts and goals for players, and unfortunately that's going to be a very reactionary, maybe tough lesson to learn like situation for a lot of people. I've already been talking with some players that have been like, man, like, you played great, you did what you could. It's just like kind of the circumstances that we're in right now, that you're comparing it to the circumstances you're familiar with from like 3 and 5 years ago or whatever. Like, whenever you set out for this journey, that the circumstances that we find ourselves in now are just completely different. Like, the criteria has just changed. It's not you did great, and you think that because you did great, you should get this type of opportunity. Well, now that the opportunities have all been shuffled around, like how you fit into that deck, like also has gotten shuffled around. That's hard to deal with, emotionally, so and I don't even really know my point there. I kind of wanted to get that off my chest, because it's been a lot of conversations we've been having that is hard to deal with. Yeah, it's hard to deal with as a player, so you kind of reshuffle that deck, reframe your mind, but at the end of the day, none of that changes anything. And the goal still's just got to be, well, what do I need to do today to take one step towards that big picture goal? And unfortunately, that's one of the punches we have to be ready to roll with these days. And it's not all just about
Absolutely.
like what you can see in front of your face. There's like a lot of things out play that are, bigger and you have no control over, external factors that we have to also be, ready and willing to roll with some of those punches too, so there's a lot of things that like we've got to be like equipped to handle, physically, mentally, emotionally throughout this game, that ultimately it's on us as coaches to help, provide some of the information, like be a resource for players, um, you know, tell them things that they may not necessarily be thinking about, that's, ahead on the mountain for them. And then also just how to, deal with some of these day-to-day things as well.
Absolutely, man. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So this time frame for people is definitely can be a fluid one. I think my biggest piece of advice in transitioning throughout summer ball is into summer time frame is have a really good assessment process of how, self-assessment process of how this past spring has went for you, where you wound up from a, physical standpoint, health standpoint, and, performance standpoint.
Yeah.
And what you need to do based off of what your big picture's goals are, what you need to do in this short little time frame and throughout this entire summer time frame, and build a plan on how you plan to get there by just continuing to ask yourself how. Well, I want to accomplish this. Well, how are you going to do that? Okay, well then I need to accomplish this. Well, how am I going to do that? How am I going to do that? Well, how am I going to do that? It's going to get you all the way down to what do I need to do today to take that next step towards that big picture goal in my career, and it'll start to get really black and white.
There you go, man.
All right. Well, thank you guys for checking out this episode. If you guys like it, drop us a like, comment, subscribe button. We really appreciate you guys checking out these episodes. If you guys got any thoughts or questions that come from this content, feel free to give us a shout. We'd love to talk with you, and we'll see you guys next time.